Um, Thank you and welcome for joining us at this ICA virtual conference. And I must thank my colleague, Professor Mohan Datta, for organizing the regional hub at Massey University in Palmerston North in New Zealand, so that at least some of us can present in person. And hopefully some of you are tuning in online. So now this is a panel, a public relations panel called Perspectives on Social Justice Research in Public Relations. In alignment with the 2021 conference theme, the purpose of this panel is to explore current scholarship pertaining to and discuss new directions for social justice-based research in public relations. Panelists will share insights from their diverse and eclectic social justice-based research that emphasizes empowerment of marginalized publics. The panel was organized by Katie Place from Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, USA, and includes her and 4 other panelists: Erica Sizek of the University of Texas in Austin, Neka Logan of Virginia Tech, and Lee Edwards from the London School of Economics, and of course, myself. Now, as I'm here in person at this hub at Massey University, I will go first, and then after I finish, we'll play the video recordings of the other 4 panelists. One of the things that I would request you is that if you have any questions or comments, please log in to the conference site and put them down, because as you know, this conference is asynchronous, so your comments and your questions will remain live for all the panelists to respond to as and when possible. Okay, so I'll start with my presentation. Right. So my presentation is called Public Relations for the Planet and Its People, Communicating Resistance as Citizenship for a Just and Sustainable World. But before I start, I would like to welcome you. Tēnā koutou katoa, e mihi ana ki ngā tohu o nehe o Aotearoa e noho ne o, ko Debashish toku ingoa. So I'm going first in this panel, as I said, because I'm in person. So hopefully, you can interact with me a little bit if you can. With the others, you listen to the videos. Okay, so this is a moment of awakening for public relations scholarship in some ways, because the planet and its people are being pushed to the brink by a cascade of calamities such as rapid climate change, raging pandemics, and growing socio-political unrest. And so this is a time for public relations to galvanize collective action and position itself as an instrument of radical social change. Now, this is very, very different from what people usually understand about public relations. This is a change that, hopefully break down the disparities in access to resources, influence in policymaking, and, generate collective action in some ways. Can we go to the next slide? Sure. So a lot of what I'm going to say today is comes out from this new book, which is a 2021 book, Public Relations and Sustainable Citizenship, which I have co-authored with Priya Kurian, which talks about a lot of resistance activities that are going on in different parts of the world and the alliances that people are building with each other. And we call it public relations of sustainable citizenship. And it's a very, very different kind of public relations from what we understand generally. So our vision of public relations is one that facilitates citizens' movements that tackle head-on some of the most urgent issues facing humans and non-humans alike on the land we live in, the air we breathe, and the water we draw on to sustain our lives. People's struggles over land, air, and water through active alliances of resistance against structures of power are what we frame as public relations as sustainable citizenship. And as you will see, our trajectory for public relations is in line with the critical approaches into the field. And I will go through that as we go along. So let's, the next slide, please, Breeze. So we do observe, though, that in both functional and non-functional approaches to public relations, there is an emphasis on actors who use strategic communication to manage their own interests or resist others' interests. Of course, actors are important, but in our book, we focus our attention not so much on the actors, but on the actions they take. In other words, instead of locating the source of public relations discourse, the actor or technologist representing an organization or an activist group, we shift our attention to the enactment of resistance and the discourses that emerge when unrepresented publics make their voices heard. These actions that come together in organic alliances of publics fighting for justice and equity is what we see as an enactment of public relations as sustainable citizenship. Now, our emphasis here is guided by a theoretical framework of resistance that draws inspiration from a variety of sources. One of them is what many of you may be aware of, the Subaltern Historiography, a collective of South Asian scholars led by Ranajit Guha from the 1980s, who talked about accounts of peasant resistance to colonial agencies. The second is the work of indigenous scholars such as Taeke Alfred in Canada, Linda Tuhiwai-Smith right here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Kyle White in the United States, who present the counter stories of resistance of colonized indigenous communities. And the third is philosopher Hannah Arendt's assertion that actions of resistance are not merely a means to an end, but also an end in itself. We blend these thoughts with our own work on what we call movements of determined resistance, often led by women in conjunction with indigenous communities and other historically marginalized communities. And the next one, please. So these are two recent books that I co-edited with colleagues of mine, Kumkum Bhavnani, John Foran, and Priya Kurian. One is Feminist Futures, Reimagining Global Climate Justice, and the other is Climate Futures. Sorry, one is Climate Futures, Reimagining Global Climate Justice, and the other is Feminist Futures, Reimagining Women, Culture, and Development. Both these books are really anthologies of stories of resistance in diverse locations, in pretty much every continent that we can think of. Africa, the Pacific Islands, the Oceania, Asia, and many other parts. And these range from, the methods used are different, but what binds them together is the resistance to taken for granted assumptions that are embedded in institutional structures. But also, one of the interesting things that I do find in this collection of stories is that although they are working in resistance, there is an element of hope. And that's what really allows us as researchers and scholars to function on that premise of hope. And this is a hope that's built through alliances across geographical locations, across platforms. And even if the interests and agendas are different, there is a solidarity. And that's what we are looking at. So this is anchored by our vision of what we have called sustainable citizenship, which problematizes power. That's really essential here. It addresses inequality and injustice, challenges dominant, entrenched elite structures of governance. It resists dominant narratives and channels of communication. It transcends human and non-human boundaries. It focuses on deliberative processes and locates shared values through a clash of ideas. So here, we are not opposed to people, clashing. Through conflict, a lot of really good ideas emerge. So we are not trying to shy away from conflict, but rather take it on head on and see what emerges, what directions comes through these areas of conflict and what we call the clash of ideas. And some of them provide pathways for the future. So in this book, what we've outlined are 3 separate sections on struggles over air, water, and land. And of course, the time that I have, I will not have the time to really go through each one of them in detail, but I'll look at them at least briefly. What we're talking about here is we're looking at examples of how historically unrepresented publics are working to change the dominant narratives in a variety of contexts. And each of these are organized by values of care and stewardship, a sense of responsibility for future generations, a profound sense of the inseparability of people from nature and the world around them. And just picking up 2 little expressions, one from the Lakota people, Ni Wikoni, water is life, and the other one right from here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Maori whakatau, ko o te awa, ko te awa, ko o. I am the river and the river is me. So let me begin with the struggles over air. And what we've focused our attention here is on the issue of climate change. Now, climate action is going on in different parts of the world. But one of the things that we have to remember is that climate change is a matter of life and death for a lot of people. I mean, some people can sit and talk about all kinds of, how much, emissions we can restore with something else. And all those are good plans and objectives. But at the foundational level, we have to remember that 3 out of 4 people living in poverty rely on agriculture and natural resources to survive, just to survive, right? And so climate change has devastating consequences for the poor and the marginalized. And so what we are trying to do here is to center that and to look at climate change through the lenses of the people who are primarily, or in a foundational way, affected by issues of climate change. The rampant extraction of resources by imperial powers in colonized lands and subsequently by local predator elites have left the lands in a state of continuing impoverishment and with depleted levels of physical and economic resources that make it daunting. It is, if not impossible, to withstand the humanitarian and environmental crises caused by climate change. The extraction-driven industries built on the platform of colonialism by the so-called richer nations of today have been primarily responsible for climate change. Yet these nations have made little attempt to take responsibility and atone for their destructive actions. The reckless capitalist pursuit of growth, production, and profit have propelled some to protect their lavish lifestyles with no regard for the negative consequences of their actions for the poor and the vulnerable. The vast disparities in access to resources underpin the structured inequalities we encounter around the world. These inequalities traverse constituencies, all of which are shaped by the other constituencies that include, but are not limited to, pensioners and senior citizens, urban slum dwellers, indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, women, the young, migrants and refugees, and rural communities. Instances of climate refugees or women affected by drought and food shortage that increase their burdens, or the Inuit population displaced by eroding shorelines and melting permafrost, are already all too frequent. In addition, millions face the risk of being drowned or losing their freshwater resources as sea levels rise, posing devastating prospects of loss for both homeland and livelihood for millions of people. Now, in Climate Futures, one of the things that we are doing is we are shifting attention to the people who are working at the front lines of climate change. And that stretches from places like Bangladesh, for instance, the vulnerable islands of the South Pacific all around us, the drought-hit stretches of Africa and West Asia, and also in South Asia and South and Central America. What it does is it recognizes that capitalism uses patriarchal structures, for example, the unpaid labor of women, to sustain the current economic system. And so by focusing attention on the stories who are actually working on the front lines, and so there are lots of interesting stories. I mean, there's one about how international development agencies, people send their staff or executives to Bangladesh to talk to them about how to deal with floods because of rising sea level rise. And now it doesn't really make sense, because the people who are working on the front lines, they are the ones who really know what it's all about. And similarly, we've seen right here, and I mentioned this briefly as well yesterday, when we look at climate change adaptation processes right here in Aotearoa, a lot of scientists are doing fantastic work with their climate modeling. But ultimately, it's the needs of the people who are affected that is not always factored into the adaptation processes. So we have to listen to their stories and see what their needs are. It's not just simple to say, the modeling shows that this area is going to be flooded in 5 years' time, so you need to move to some other land. What happens with that movement? What are the consequences? What happens to the spiritual and ancestral links to that land? How do we compensate that? How do we work around those issues? And people are working on those kinds of issues in different parts of the world. While still on the topic of air, there are a lot of climate justice movements that we can see, and many of you would have seen in the last few years. Young and indigenous groups are coming to the fore. The school strike for climate was really an amazing thing to see school children out there in pretty much every city in the world, including here in New Zealand, marching for climate justice. And they are not really being prompted by institutions. So, these are young people who really want their futures to be safeguarded. And similarly, we've had movements, Te Ara Whatu right here in New Zealand, and Gen Zero. And there are more mainstream groups such as Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion as well, which are working alongside. It's a slight, digression here to come back to the whole notion of how we resist some of the mainstream public relations practices. Now, if you go back to some of the mainstream public relations practices, it is built on manipulative corporate strategies. The first of these, and we talk about three kinds of washing in our book. The first of these is very well known, greenwashing, right? So you have these big corporates, fossil fuel industries, which are really ravaging the earth, but they have appropriated the discourse of climate change. And if you see their ads and their campaigns, it's all about, advancing possibilities and, for the future, clean fuel. And it's interesting again, that many of these corporations present this image. They go out and say that we are for the climate, right? And yet, if you look at their own spreadsheets and balance sheets, you'll find how many more billions they're still spending on the extraction of fossil fuel, which override anything that they may be doing to save the planet. So that's one kind of washing. The other two that we talk about in our book is youth washing and democracy washing. And youth washing is how, having seen how young people are at the forefront of these struggles against climate change, there are a lot of big corporations that are now trying to co-opt young people and founding some rival kinds of bodies which on paper seem to be working on issues of climate change, but they are actually there just to maintain the status quo. And it's a good thing that a lot of young people haven't fallen for that. So that's, so you offer them scholarships, you offer them free trips to conferences somewhere in the United States. And that's how, they're trying to, cooperate young people and say that this, we are for the youth as well. But that's, hardly the reality. So we've called that youth washing, and the other is democracy washing, because a lot of things are happening in the name of democracy. And so many of these corporations are now in league with states, for instance, so it's, and who claim a democratic mandate to continue to rip apart the planet, apart from ripping apart, the souls of poor people as well. And one of the things that we say here is that resisting any such washing, whatever kind it might be, requires turning to the lived experience of subaltern public. So actually focus our attention on the experiences of those people who are working at those front lines. Now, so apart from air, we have two separate sections on water and land as well. And again, in the interest of time, I won't really go into too much detail about that. But in the section on water, we talk about the privatization of water and the struggles against the privatization of water, whether it's in Bolivia and Latin America, or right here against the bottling of some 23 billion liters of water is bottled right here in Aotearoa. And there are movements against this as well. Now, what we are trying to see here is that, many of these movements are forging alliances across continents. So if it's on water, they are in touch with people who are fighting against privatization of water, etc., but also across other kinds of issues. And so one of the most striking things was, most of you would be familiar with the movement or the agitation at Standing Rock, for instance, right? It was covered quite widely, where indigenous populations were fighting against the Dakota pipeline, the oil pipeline, which were going through their native territories and threatening their own water resources. Now, one of the most striking things to see there was Black Lives Matters activists standing there alongside them. And, so again, the objectives are different, but the forging of alliances which bring together these marginalized or dispossessed groups together is really a sign of a different kind of public relations of sustainable citizenship that we call. So that was on water. And on land, we focus on primarily, land is something, and Christine's talk this morning was really interesting. Land is a powerful construct as well. And we talk about the issue of Palestine. And the movement of the BDS, which is the Boycott, Divestments and Sanctions movement, that is going on across the country. And it is a different kind of public relations, which is trying to get people who are oppressed by colonial structures of some kind or the other to bind together and fight back against the colonization of their land. And it's really a sorry state of affairs of what's going on in Israel, Palestine right now. And as we were mentioning yesterday in the session as well, that a lot of people, talk about peace in the Middle East and talk about the two-party solution. And yet, even states that profess to support the two-party solution are actually, still supporting that single state, because the Palestinian state is not being formally recognized. And so these resistant movements are trying to say that the voice of the Palestinian people need to be out there, out in the mainstream, to resist some of these taken for granted structures that, say that, oh, it's a conflict between two sides. It's not really a conflict between two sides. It's a conflict that affects people who've been dispossessed of their own land. So those are the two sections on water and land alongside air. And so we talk about, three areas of leverage for change that are foundation to bringing about any kind of change. One is institutional change, which is about restructuring, referring to change, stability, and learning in institutions. The other is value change, which is reconnecting, targeting interactions between people and nature, and knowledge change, which is rethinking how knowledge is produced and used. And we'd like to think that the climate justice movements that I talked briefly about and in greater detail in the other two books that I referred to have been able to contribute to all three. So I'll probably, I realize I've taken quite a bit of time, and I'll end with what I mentioned a short while ago, that we live on hope. And so many of these struggles are about holding on to hope, because that's what will really forge the resistance movements together. There's a lot to learn from the amazing work communities are doing to change oppressive structures for a just and sustainable world. And there's a lot more we can do together. And I'll end with this quote from Angela Davis: "It is in collectivities that we find reservoirs of hope and optimism." So collectivities is, or the alliances of collectivities between various groups that are marginalized in a range of different contexts, their coming together is what we are framing as public relations and sustainable citizenship. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll now turn to the videos of my fellow panelists. And if you have any questions or comments, I'd really love you to go to the website and put them down so that everybody can see and my fellow panelists can respond to them as well. But if you have right here, if any of you have any questions, I'm of course around here to respond to them. So thank you, Breeze, if you could play the videos.
Hello, and thank you to the International Communication Association and the Public Relations Division for hosting this panel on social justice and care-based research in public relations. I am Katie Place. I'm an associate professor of strategic communication at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, where I research at the intersections of power, ethics, gender, and now listening in public relations. Over the next few minutes, I hope to share some of my experiences conducting social justice-based research and some ideas for further advancing our public relations division. So social justice research in public relations is truly lacking. A quick glance at the Communications and Mass Media Complete database yielded only about 14 explicit social justice-based research entries. Most recently, an article by our own panelist Nika Logan and co-author Damian Waymer explored Nike and its corporate social justice and social advocacy efforts. How did I get the spark to conduct social justice-based research? Well, in the early 2000s, I started my career in corporate public affairs. Like many PR graduates, I had entered the profession armed with my master's degree, having just studied community support efforts and dialogic principles on Fortune 500 websites. However, my experiences in PR and the listening I did in those spaces immediately called for me to raise questions with regard to the disempowerment of publics, the lack of ethics and transparency to publics, and the sheer power of corporations to silence or route opportunities away for dialogue from activists or marginalized communities. For example, sitting at lunch with corporate lobbyists in 2003, I overheard efforts to shape conversations regarding energy, and how a team went into the boroughs of New York City and knocked on doors to ask low-income African-American residents to sign a petition supporting clean, renewable energy. And they said, if you do not sign this petition, we will build another coal plant right in your backyard. Similar experiences ensued where I was engaged in corporate clients' astroturfing efforts that lacked complete transparency and respect for publics. So, the issue that remains is that marginalized and functionalist theories of public relations focus on organizational power and their abilities or their strengths to communicate and ignore the lived experiences, power inequalities, and opportunities for communication of marginalized publics. Therefore, my most recent research, conducted with panelist Erica Cizik, applied a subaltern studies perspective to really understand those institutional frameworks, those socio-cultural contexts, and power dynamics that serve as barriers when working for social change. Our work was heavily influenced by that of Mohan Dutta and colleagues. Dutta argues, as a critical response to subordination, a subaltern critique is an interrogation of erasures, posing how and by whom history is written, and whose voices are represented and whose are erased. Power and representation are central to the project of subaltern studies. So as a scholar interested in those intersections of gender, power, ethics, and listening, I volunteered with a group called, I'm going to call them Equality Moms. It's a group of primarily low-income African-American women who are advocating for fair housing, prison reform, affordable health care, and food security. Over the years, I simply attended the meetings as an ally and a listener, constantly considering my privilege, my experiences as a middle-class white suburban resident. After years of efforts to expand their presence online and have their voices heard on a more regional or national level, Equality Moms felt a sense of we aren't being heard. Something is just not happening for us. So together we embarked on this research to understand Equality Moms and their relationship with dialogue and digital media. Throughout this entire process, all of the research participants, and here's a photo of some of the Equality Moms, were total co-creators with this research effort. We always conducted our interviews and then relayed our findings and those themes back to Equality Moms. So we found three key things with the research that we co-created together. There are myths and high expectations with regard to social media and its dialogic power. It was assumed that if you used a hashtag, your post and your voice was going to be heard and acknowledged on that larger global space, but it was not. Equality Moms cited that the real power of social media for them was interpersonal organizing in spaces like Facebook. Instead, Equality Moms felt a sense of invisibility and erasure, though. Participants instead acknowledged the hardship of being heard if you don't have a budget or help to boost your posts or constantly create content. And in their communities, there was actual real erasure or exclusion from dialogue. Members cited, for example, Board of Alders meetings that were held as late as 11 p.m. at night in order to exclude marginalized members of the community from speaking out against developers or initiatives that would directly affect them. Ultimately, Equality Moms felt a sense of vulnerability and risk. Their unmediated testimony in person at the Capitol or at protests were the most powerful way to get their voices heard. But this always came with the risks of identification or complete loss of privacy. So how can we move the discipline forward? I propose three things, and these are not new, but I do believe we need to emphasize them much more strongly in our public relations work. So more work needs to engage a feminist ethic of care in public relations. This perspective is so valuable because it rejects masculine cultural norms that rationalize historically marginalized individuals' subordination, and it holds that universal rules of moral justice do not exist. It emphasizes a sustaining of connections, listening to and considering the voiceless. And it questions whose interests are worthy of debate, who gets to talk, and who is regarded as an effective communicator to whom others must listen. So applying a feminist ethic of care, I have examined the digital, social, and mobile media best practices for fostering dialogic relationships with marginalized communities. In particular, I have found that we must listen to the particular lived experiences with compassion. PR efforts must focus on relationships and human interaction over click rates and outcomes. And similar to the Equality Moms research, PR professionals must engage publics on an individual level with attention to privacy, harm versus care values, and avoiding instrumentalization of publics for organizational gain. So moving the discipline forward, we need to apply much more research focused on listening too. And we need to listen to ourselves and be reflexive with regard to our own biases and positionality. We definitely need to smash that 80-20 ratio of organizations just speaking and outputting information versus listening. We must begin by listening to ourselves and being reflexive with regard to our own biases and positionality as PR professionals and researchers. We should also engage in intersectional listening, particularly as We consider ourselves as beneficiaries of particular forms of racial, settler, colonial, or able privileges. Citing Rice, Harrison, and Friedman, I believe it is so important for us to account for our own knowledge, positionality, and social reality versus critical self-reflexivity. Additionally, we must listen to understand the nuanced, intersectional identities of our publics. Citing Parks, we must listen to understand the values, histories, and contextual stories and meanings of our publics. We must listen with the understanding that all of us at one time or another will be in social positions in which the intersections of our unique bodies and societal expectations of those bodies will cause us to be labeled. Some of my most recent research with listening has identified these themes. We must listen to ourselves, and we must listen at interpersonal, organizational, and the systemic and community levels in order to attend to these intersectional differences of our publics. So third, I do believe that additional research must be conducted to attend to power differentials, and I believe intersectionality and further application of subaltern studies is so important. So intersectionality is so important because it's the notion that power relations affect the interplay and mutual shaping of social categories such as age, race, gender, sexuality, ability, and ethnicity across individual and societal existence. We must recognize that forces of power and oppression occur at multiple levels, particularly at the interpersonal and cultural levels in public relations work we do. Additionally, I urge public relations professionals and scholars to continue scholarship from a subaltern studies framework to examine the public's erasure by mainstream communication and public relations efforts. We as scholars must be mindful how we contribute to the erasure of voices or carry out exploitative practices. We must combat erasure and promote representation by giving voice to the ordinariness of marginalized individuals' lives and prioritize their authority of experience. We must commit to listen, engage, and challenge the status quo instead of exploiting subaltern populations. Communicators must facilitate long-term relationships founded on listening and compassion. So ultimately, how is PR the cog in a much larger wheel of oppression and disempowerment? Through social justice and care-based research, I believe that we must think of PR as always inherently linked to the individuals we are engaging and how those practices could potentially empower or exploit.
Greetings. Thank you for tuning into this video, to this presentation, and thank you to my fellow panelists for their presentations as well, and to this conference for making space for this topic and for considering social justice as a cornerstone for communication and for thinking about how this plays out within public relations. My name is Dr. Erica Cizik, and I am at the University of Texas at Austin. Today, I am going to be speaking about queer theory and deconstructing binaries as an intervention for social justice in public relations. Deconstruction, I believe, is fundamental to social justice and is an intervention for public relations. And I'm specifically interested in the disruption and challenging and queering of binaries as a foundation to rethinking public relations. I understand binaries as social constructs that are composed of two parts that are framed as absolute and unchanging opposites. My argument is that binaries, while make for quantifying and measuring projects and publics, they're unproductive in our contemporary landscape, and static thinking is not going to lead us forward. Okay. In spaces that are constantly moving and developing, we need theory and practice that's kinetic. Our contemporary globalized geopolitical landscape, the world we live in and negotiate in, is much more diverse complex and messy. And so I'm putting forth and building off of previous work here on queer theorizing for advancing some of our intellectual projects in public relations. First, I will share a little bit about queer as a concept and queer theory more broadly, and then I'll talk a little bit about insights from my research on historically marginalized publics and the grounding in social justice-based research that really emphasizes the empowerment of marginalized publics. And then I'll touch on some interventions that I think this approach can have for public relations theory. In 2018, I published an article in the Journal of Public Relations Research called Queering Public Relations. And in this manuscript, in this article, I set the foundations for much of this thinking. And I continue to build off of this. For the purposes of this presentation, however, I want to reiterate some of the points that I made in that article. And I'm happy to share with anyone that would like a copy of that article. So in order to sort of set the foundation for the larger conversation today, I understand queer as a simultaneously political and intellectual endeavor. So it is both a form of activism as well as a scholarly inquiry that is less dependent on constructing or protecting specific identities than on critiquing normative values and assumptions. So fundamental to the project of queer theory really is the deconstruction and the analysis and the critique of normativity. Queer activism really is about challenging dominant institutions and structures and normative social relationships, which public relations plays a role in, both the production of these institutions and structures as well as the deconstruction of these structures and institutions. Queer inquiry, therefore, is a theoretical approach that problematizes binaries. It resists identity as essential, and it challenges the categorization of identities. It also is about examining underlying power structures and power relations in order to reveal the complexity, the chaos, and the contextuality. Okay, so queer theory is really building on larger theoretical and intellectual projects of post-structuralism. The feminist cultural studies scholar Teresa de Lauretis coined the term queer theory in 1990. She heard queer activists utilizing the term queer. She heard activists and artists using the historically pejorative term queer in the 1980s as a form of empowerment. It was intended to be provocative, and she paired the word queer with the academic word theory in order to be deliberately disruptive. For de Lauretis, the term queer theory troubled not only homosexuality, but the discourses on which sexual identity is also founded, thereby sort of creating an analytic framework to challenge the complacencies with identity politics she was observing in lesbian and gay studies at the time. Again, and this is in the 1980s, 1990s. So in contrast to some of the conversations that were happening in the academy at the time, queer theory really called for the deconstruction of identities and what Green calls pulling the gay and lesbian out of gay and lesbian studies. Okay, and so it became a much larger intellectual and academic and activist project around the deconstruction of identities. So I understand queer not so much as an identity as a critique of identity, okay, and form of cultural criticism that really denaturalizes and defamiliarizes identities, sort of exploding categories of identities and opening them up for analysis and examining how subjectivity is both formed and reformed in everyday practices, and the ways in which public relations plays a role in that formation and reformation of practice, of structure, of identity and representations. Okay, radical deconstructionism is the predominant strain of of queer theory, such that it challenges the scientific bases of sexual identity and gender identity and the reduction of the sexual and gendered identity categories, thereby problematizing classification as a unit of analysis. Okay. So queer, therefore, operates as a tool. It's an analytic framework that's really tasked at destabilizing and deconstructing identity categories and revealing these identity categories as complex and multiple, which fits with the larger project of this panel, which is focused on social justice. Over the past 10 years or so, I've spent my time researching the intersections of activism and marginality. Most recently, my work has focused on the lives and experiences of transgender and gender diverse individuals. I recognized early on in my research that it was an unfair assessment to look solely at groups of people as collectives. For example, the first 5 or so years of my studies, I was really looking at what I called LGBTQ activism. But in reality, there was so much more nuance that was being lost in my research when I didn't take a critical eye at deconstructing the context and the history of those identity groups and how they became allied with one another within an acronym that made for strategic essentialism that was both politically productive in some regards, but also erased a lot of the nuance and identity. And so I, over the past couple of years, have really focused on the T that has been invisible in LGBT and that has been essentially marginalized and silenced and erased in public relations. So over the past couple of years, I've spent time doing sort of queer research on trans and gender diverse individuals in communication spaces, looking at the role of trans communicators as cultural intermediaries and their use of public relations and activism in the intersections of those spaces. I want to share with you a couple images from my most recent projects here. The one on the left is a tweet from a Washington Post reporter, and it's in reference to an activism by a group from the Trans Latina Coalition. So this image was taken in October 2018. Activists attended a Game 5 of the World Series, which in the United States is one of the biggest cultural sporting events in the field of baseball. And this took place in Los Angeles. And during the game, activists unfurled a large banner that read, "Trans people deserve to live." The banner was made and placed by activists from the Trans Latina Coalition, whose mission, according to the organization, is to advocate for the specific needs of the trans Latina community that resides in the United States and to plan strategies that improve our quality of life. So this particular image was snapped and it was captured on social media sites. This protest during the game came less than a week after President Trump said that his administration was considering changing the ways it treats transgender people under the law. The Health and Human Services Department had been pushing for a change which would seek to negate the claims that gender identity could be used for protection under federal rights laws. And so a change like this could lead to consider a transgender person's sex determined at birth, sort of negating much of the work that transgender activists had been engaging in over the past several decades. And then the image on the right is of one of my participants, who is the CEO, president, and founder of the Trans Latina Coalition. And she's very vocal about her work and is sort of often at the front lines of her activism and the activism of the organization. So I'd like to turn our attention to thinking about the interventions that challenging binaristic thinking, queering public relations can have for public relations research and the larger intellectual endeavors of the field. I'm sort of charging my intervention in social justice grounding in the idea that we as scholars need to trouble and to rethink the very identities, knowledge sources, and politics that have historically defined public relations. For me, it is about pushing the boundaries. It is about pushing beyond binaries to acknowledge and to understand the flow between people and places. Understanding in the example of the Trans Latina Coalition, for example, that identities are implicated not only in gender, sexuality, but in immigration status, in age, in ability, in a variety of intersectional matrices, okay? And it's fundamental for us as scholars, and therefore also for practitioners, that we acknowledge and understand this flow. The flow of people, the flow of resources, the flow of commerce and trade, et cetera, and how these flows have become increasingly integrated into our everyday lives and into the lives and the communicative structures of our field. So for us, it's important as an intellectual project, as well as a practical and pedagogical practice, how we take into account stakeholders, multiple overlapping identities, exploring how these social identities interact and may impact the reception, the comprehension, and the interpretation of strategic messaging. If we go back to the example of the unfurling of the Trans Lives banner, this is a very sort of public moment in a very American nationalistic event. Oftentimes baseball signifies sort of Americana. And so understanding the contextuality, the historicity of that moment is very important. And seeing this as a moment of public relations, I think, is also important. If we think of the ways in which the binary of public relations versus activism has been historically, the way the field has been structured over the past decade, there has been a challenging of that by scholars and intellectuals. So in public relations, just to echo the focus of this particular panel, we really need to complicate the simplification of identities that leads to the instrumentalization and commodification of individuals and groups. That is of utmost importance as a social justice intervention. We need to combine intersecting identity categories like race and gender and sexuality and understanding them as kinetic when we're studying power and agency in media and communication. And that needs to be rooted in the knowledge production and the lived experiences of publics and producers with multiple overlapping and competing identities. So understanding the complexity and deconstructing that complexity. We need to challenge the categories and meanings that are associated with audiences and publics, examining how groups of individuals come together and coalesce. In our practice and in our research, strategic decision-making often involves segmenting stakeholders around demographic and psychographic categories. But I think we need to take a step back, as many of us have over the past several years, and to challenge and deconstruct these categories, really thereby calling attention to how they are socially constructed and classified, and asking ourselves whether they serve us, who they serve, and what they suggest about power structures and where interventions may be needed. I want to share with you this playful cartoon, but I think it's a helpful way to think about ways we can make more complex categories of identity. In this particular example, I get very personal here for a second, but if you think about teaching and pedagogy and thinking about basic audience segmentation, you might ask someone a variety of questions that the nuances of which might not be captured in simple multiple choice categorical measures, right? However, what if we blew that up and looked at it more complexly, right? In this infographic here, we have sex, gender identity as continuum, as non-binary, right? And we can, this might be a useful exercise, both from a practical perspective as well as from a pedagogical perspective. Okay, in conclusion, I want to sort of leave you with some takeaways. The image here is of queer activists during the LGBTQ Pride Parade in Dublin, Ireland in July 2016. I think it's important to look at the black banner that says queer liberation, not rainbow capitalism. What I'm not advocating for here is rainbow capitalism. For me, this is about understanding and challenging the instrumentalization of identities as fundamental to social justice. We need to challenge binaries and dichotomies. It's imperative. The reality of our field and of our practice is multiplicitous and intersectional. Therefore, we need to focus on moving beyond binaries and attending to the spaces that exist between. There is a practical dimension here such that the intersections of public relations and other promotional fields are invested in this work, and we need to think about how to expand, both within our fields and with similar fields of study. So I encourage you to get messy intellectually, to get chaotic, and I look forward to questions or comments or provocations. Thank you for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you.
Hi everyone, I am Nika Logan, and the title of my presentation today is Exploring a Corporate Responsibility to Race, How Organizations Can Serve as Conduits for Racial Justice. The corporate responsibility to race theory holds that corporations should communicate in ways that advocate for racial justice, attempt to improve race relations, and support achieving a more equitable and harmonious society. Corporations have this responsibility to race because corporations have historically perpetuated and profited from racial oppression, making them contributors to and benefactors of racial injustice. I argue that these circumstances obligate corporations to work towards achieving racial justice. And this is part of my ongoing research about the relationships between corporations, race, responsibility, and communication as conceptualized through public relations. The corporate responsibility to race theory in many ways draws upon critical race theory, and here I have outlined several critical race theory principles that were articulated by Lee Edwards in 2012. I'm not going to go over each one, and of course you can pause the video to read them in close detail, but I will hit a few of the ones that are most relevant for this particular presentation. First, race is socially constructed. It is not a biological given. Next, racism is a normal aspect of life, not an aberrant event or situation. It is ordinary, and its ordinary appearance makes it difficult to address. The next critical race theory principle I want to emphasize is that racism is embedded in social systems and structures. Next, I'll focus on number 8 here, that critical race scholarship is marked by a commitment to social justice. And finally, history influences the shape of current social systems and structures. Therefore, understanding and addressing racism is not possible without taking into account past inequities. This image or slide here represents some of those past inequities. And in doing so, it also articulates a relationship, a historical relationship between business organizations and corporations and their treatment of race. So you can see, for example, here, corporations like Aetna Life Insurance perpetuated racial oppression by ensuring the lives of Black people, but not as human beings, but as property, as slaves. So Aetna at that time recognized no inherent value in the life of a Black person, but only their property value as a slave. Newspaper organizations also profited from slavery by running ads of runaway slaves or slaves for sale. And then you can also see down here what this is a receipt for a corporation that was buying or leasing slaves. And corporations often, railroad corporations, that is, let me be specific, railroad corporations also perpetuated racial oppression through buying and leasing slaves for their labor. And post-slavery, many railroads engaged in racial oppression and exploitation by exploiting the labor of Chinese immigrants who also helped build the railroads. Those historical conceptualizations and relations of race discussed on the previous slide have implications for the way that race is experienced in America today. And some of these images illustrate the more dramatic tensions over race in America. So this image is from the Unite the Right rally, march, and violent protest that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia. And recently, we've seen an uptick in white supremacist, neo-Nazi, racist advocacy and also action. We've seen the rise of Black Lives Matter as a part of how we might characterize race in America. And in response to Black Lives Matter, we've also seen counter protests or counter advocacy from All Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, and any number of other groups. There was also the tragic killing of Mexican people in El Paso, Texas, where the assailant there said his goal was to kill as many Mexicans as possible. And most prominently right now, especially given the trial, is the death and honestly what I would consider the murder of George Floyd there by a Minneapolis police officer. All of these instances are examples of the tensions around race in America and the difficulties that we continue to have in addressing racism. And all of those images definitely justify and give credence to Donna Lynn Pomper's assertion that it's time for critical race theory in public relations, given the nearly 3 decades of myopia. And Professor Pomper is actually the first scholar to introduce critical race theory in public relations. And again, the images we just saw kind of give further credence to her assertion there that it's time for critical race theory in public relations, given myopia, decades of myopia. Another thing that I think it's really important to recognize why we as public relations scholars want to focus on race and critically interrogate it is is exemplified here in the work of Lee Edwards, who said, race is one of the most powerful ideological instrumental factors in how power and identity and privilege are constructed, right? So, because race is so powerful and so significant and the way it shapes our lives, it's important that we direct attention to it in public relations. So a question emerges, which is what can we do? What can we do as public relations scholars and practitioners to address these issues of race, race relations, and racial injustice, not only in the US, but around the world? Edelman tapped into this in one of their recent Edelman Trust reports, and they give us an inclination here. Their research and their work showed that consumers want brands to speak out on matters of racial justice in America, and that opens the door and kind of gives justification for public relations scholars and practitioners to walk down that road of exploring how our work can support racial justice. And we've seen a plethora of recent corporate discourse on race and supporting racial justice. I would argue that, and many people would and have disagreed with me, but that Starbucks was among the first corporations to really start talking about a responsibility to race and using their corporate voice to demonstrate a commitment to racial justice. And I argue and have argued that they did so through their Race Together campaign. And if you look at, this is one of their campaign materials here, and if you look at it, you can see that what's emphasized there is the state of race, race relations, and the company is trying to educate consumers about race in America as well as promote critical thinking about racism. And I argue that campaign was an effort to advance conversations about race in America and may fit within the corporate responsibility to race framework. Ben and Jerry's is another really prominent example, and they've been praised for their corporate discourse on race. And I believe if they're not the only, they are among the only corporations to have racial justice as a corporate value. And they were an early supporter of Black Lives Matter. Another example is AT&T. Their CEO, Randall Stephenson, made a rather impassioned speech supporting racial justice and Black Lives Matter back in 2016 and argued that supporting Black Lives Matter does not mean you don't support other organizations and that other lives don't matter. It just merely means that it's merely an acknowledgement of racism and its implications in America. Therefore, we should all be interested in learning more about Black Lives Matter and perhaps seeing why there is support for the organization. More recently, we have seen sports leagues and organizations engaging in racial justice conversation, and you see that here through the WNBA and the NBA's support of Black Lives Matter, and they wore several racial justice messages on their uniforms. And then finally, there's another example here from Procter & Gamble, who initiated the Look advertising campaign, which showed various images of racial bias from different perspectives. And this builds on actually a previous campaign they did called The Talk, where they attempted to show how Black parents have had to educate their children about what it meant to be Black in America and how one might have to face and then manage racism and racial injustice. More recent examples come from Major League Baseball, who announced a boycott of the All-Star game in Atlanta as a result of an attempt to limit or restrict voting access in the state of Georgia. Baseball took a strong stance on that, apparently in an effort to support racial justice. Another example of a corporation attempting to demonstrate a responsibility to race, in my view, would be the campaign from Target, and more than a campaign, a commitment to spend $2 billion with Black owned businesses. And you can see the news release there as well as look it up on your own. And that might seem excessive to some people, $2 billion to support Black owned businesses. But if we think about it with a critical race theory lens, it may not seem so excessive. We can think about Target's commitment within the context of what's happened to Black businesses in the United States of America. And we might think about that example from Black Wall Street, which was a thriving Black business area, burnt to the ground as a result of anti-Black racism there in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And this image is provided by the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum. And what's also important to think about and recognize here is that this is just one example of what I'm sure are thousands of examples, if not more, of where Black enterprise and business was attacked and destroyed simply as a result of racism. Target's efforts demonstrate, at least I would argue, a commitment to racial justice through their support of Black businesses. And racial justice can be defined as the systematic, fair treatment of all people or of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. Racial justice or racial equity goes beyond anti-racism. It is not just the absence of discrimination and inequities, but also the presence of deliberate systems and supports to achieve and sustain racial equity through proactive and preventative measures. And we can really think about that Target's commitment of $2 billion within this framework for racial justice. In conclusion, I think what's important to recognize is that we do need new approaches to deal with systemic and structural racism. The corporate responsibility to The corporate responsibility to race theory articulates a path forward. My ideas mark the beginning of a discussion about corporations' race and responsibility, not the end of the discussion. And these ideas may raise more questions than solutions, but why not explore the possibilities? Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Lee Edwards. I'm a Professor of Strategic Communication and Public Engagement at the LSE, and I want to talk today a little bit about perhaps a slightly provocative way of thinking about diversity based on the research that I've been doing over the past few years. My starting point is that there is a real danger of diversity initiatives remaining performative in and of themselves, rather than generating long-term changes in voice and recognition, which is of course what they're designed to do, or what they ostensibly say they're designed to do. But I think if we only trust codes of practice and strategies and good intentions, then we fail to recognize the fundamental dynamics of self-interest that affects the fortunes of diverse practitioners in the PR industry. And my view has always been that this is grounded in PR's professionalization project, which is undertaken by institutions and individuals, and is focused on making sure that PR retains its legitimacy and its jurisdiction. And the result of that kind of objective is that it's an exclusionary exercise. It's an effort to define who does and doesn't belong in PR, and diversity initiatives then have to be understood in terms of the ways in which they feed into that project and facilitate a higher status for public relations, rather than generate some kind of moral identity for the occupation. And I think, and I'm just going to start sharing some slides here. What's really important, I think, in this is that the client is a really defining feature, indeed, of many professionalisation projects, but particularly of public relations, insofar as the objective of PR as a service is to provide security for the client, to ensure that the client is confident, is reassured in the support that they're getting. And so the occupation justifies its legitimacy and its jurisdiction on the basis of its ability to service clients in this way and realise their interests by facilitating connection and dialogue with audiences. And this will be familiar to everyone who's watching, I'm sure. But the result of that is that the professionalisation project remains very risk averse and very focused on homophily, i.e. the fact that practitioners or more successful, more desirable practitioners will appear to be more like the client because that makes the client feel more confident if somebody like them is giving them the kind of advice that they need in terms of their communications. And this produces a very classed and racialized and gendered archetype of the right kind of practitioner. It's characterized, that practitioner is characterized also by whiteness and a multidimensional nature of whiteness. This is not just about skin color, but whiteness itself in public relations is often unspoken. So it's a benchmark, but it's never actually explicitly described as a benchmark. It's simply implicitly there. And if you're different from it, then any kind of difference becomes difficult because it introduces doubt in your ability to service the client. And these are a couple of quotes from practitioners from a study I did a decade ago. It's worth noting that more recent work done by the industries themselves here in the UK has found exactly the same kind of dynamics going on. But these two quotes are particularly interesting in relation to whiteness. The first is from a practitioner who was taking part in an internship program and kind of interpreted or rather experienced the very behavioural orientation of the program as a focus on whiteness. She was a person of colour. And also in the second quote, we see Cordelia, who was a very senior public relations practitioner, and describes the way that she is perceived as a body out of place in Nimapua's expression, a body out of place, somebody who isn't expected to be in this senior level, to be in a decision-making place. And this goes back to obviously the notion that leadership is characterised by whiteness, as Nick and Logan has previously argued. And I want to argue that we have to understand these dynamics as part of the pursuit of capital. And the pursuit of capital, of course, has been racialized for centuries. Colonialism was predicated on the racialization of labor, the displacement of white labor by enslaved black and brown bodies that made the pursuit of capital more profitable and preserved the superiority of whiteness as the benchmark for, in inverted commas, civilized humanity. We also see divisions of markets and market locations for whites and others. Those are also very historically grounded, but they continue to exist today, where as consumers, discrimination and separation exists both algorithmically and in material form, where if you are black, you're far more likely to be followed by a store detective, to be asked what you're doing, to be looked at suspiciously, or indeed to have some shops less available to you than in white neighborhoods, for example, fresh food shops or high-end shops. We see arguably, or I would argue, these dynamics of racialization and the subjugation of people of color in occupations that shows a parallel to the historical dynamics of colonialism, where black bodies were made to work in the service of whiteness. And here in occupations, we see that racialized practitioners have to work harder and longer to get promotion than their white counterparts, have to prove their worth multiple times across multiple contexts in order to be trusted with responsibility. And I'm arguing that there's a continuity in relations of production and consumption that we have to recognize as part of the dynamic of institutional racism in public relations, because it's the only way to understand the systemic and process-driven realities of racism in practice. These are repeated patterns that can't really be comprehended in terms of individuals' choices or mistakes or microaggressions. So we have to locate racism, I think, in relation in its relationship with capital in this context. So what does that mean? Well, I'm arguing then that practitioners effectively become commodities for the occupation, forms of capital that the occupation uses to facilitate profit. This in turn means that they have to be marketable and appeal to the consumers of PR services. But if we know capital is always racialized, then what implications does this then have? Well, first of all, within the occupational field, we can argue that while the archetypal practitioner is marketable based on their skills or their talent or their fit with the client, all these dynamics are insufficient for a racialized practitioner to be acceptable. Instead, the market needs to explicitly make space for them to confirm that they represent a form of value, because that cannot be taken for granted. And I think this can occur in three ways. First of all, clients might want more diversity in their staffing for whatever reason. Secondly, there may be pressure from social norms that mitigate against discrimination, so there is an effort to incorporate or at least nominally argue that diversity is a good thing and to take some steps to promote that. Or thirdly, it might occur when practitioners' expertise and skill is unequivocal. So if you like, in inverted commas, they might pass as post-race, as a body where the racialization of that body can be overlooked because other things compensate. And we've seen this again in historical terms in many different ways, where people of colour have passed between communities on the basis of different criteria than their racialization. I just want to show here a couple of quotes from recruiters. This is a more recent study that I did with a colleague at the University of Leeds a couple of years ago. And these quotes in particular explain the client orientation of the professional project. Now, they are by recruiters who work either within or for public relations companies. So the first one is an in-house recruiter, and they're talking about the actual client, the user of that consultancy service. Are they going to feel reassured? Are they going to feel hopeful? You have to recruit people who can facilitate that emotion in a client, not necessarily expertise. The third quote is also the same recruiter, and she talks again about diversity for us is just trying to make our PRs reflect our clients. We need to, this is a 100% client orientation towards ensuring that the client will buy into the company because it's a company that caters to and knows what they need. The other two quotes here are from recruitment agencies who service the PR industry, and they talk here about the fact that diversity is really largely irrelevant to their service. If diversity, unless diversity is requested by the client, then it's not necessary to cater for it in their recruitment processes. And the last quote illustrates the importance of profit, and implicitly then the importance of presenting candidates who will service their profit and in turn the profit of the clients that they are delivering that service to. Just quickly, I wanted to look also at the idea of racialized capital beyond the occupational field. So in the context of client markets, not markets for PR services. We know, of course, as I've already said, that markets are racialized, but what happens to race in contemporary markets where consumers, for example, are becoming more and more diverse? And I think that this is problematic because simply having more diverse consumers or more diverse audiences doesn't necessarily deracinate markets. On the contrary, I think in many ways it facilitates the myth of a post-race world. We're all consumers, we can all consume in the same space, therefore race and racism no longer exists, or at least is unimportant, is no longer a factor that we need to take into account. We are united, if you like, in our sameness as consumers. And not only that, but the organisations that welcome us in as diverse consumers can also claim to be post-race because they recognise in turn that racism is wrong and race is irrelevant to consumption. Of course, the danger here is that the business case for diversity is in danger of falling flat on its face. If all our customers are the same, if all orient towards us as consumers rather than as individuals or individuals with very specific histories, then why on earth do we need to communicate with them differently? Of course, things are a bit more complicated than that. Clients may feel that they need to be more diverse themselves, again, just as PR agencies might want to be more diverse themselves. They might want to reflect the makeup of their customers, appeal to them more authentically, and thereby foster long-term loyalty, bringing back in the profit motive. Or alternatively, there may be situations where the histories of racism do intervene in markets and specific understanding of certain audiences is required. So, for example, in voter drives or in vaccination campaigns where high levels of mistrust might exist among communities of colour because of the history of medical exploitation and voter exploitation in the past. Here, the racialized practitioner does become a useful form of capital, but is usually deployed as a necessary addition and not a replacement to the normative archetypal practitioner. And I just want to take in a couple of quotes here from other practitioners who articulated this need to speak to audiences, if you like, in their own voices, somebody who understands where these audiences, how they're living and where they're from. And I think the second quote here is actually really interesting because this is a person of colour who who hadn't experienced any kind of racism, but she, in describing her background, might be regarded as one of the global elite. So she's somebody whose ethnicity is an illustration of her multiracial, international, global identity. She's travelled a lot. She's very comfortable in different places. So she's a different kind of diverse practitioner from those who make up the bulk of the very small percentage of people of colour in UK PR. So where is there space for resistance in these contexts? Well, as I say, there are some problems really in terms of where we traditionally have looked for resistance. First of all, in commercial markets, I would argue that the business case is undermined by increased diversity because markets and clients use it to evidence a post-race world, and therefore the need for a more diverse practitioner body is eliminated. In public sector work, you can have, particularly in public sector work, you can have diversity being justified by the specific communication requirements of racial and ethnic difference among audiences, but that in turn runs the risk of reifying racialization and stereotyping and pigeonholing practitioners. And of course, within the field, certainly practitioner status is dependent on its service to occupational capital. Practitioners are treated as capital. That's true for all practitioners, but because we know capital is always racialized, then racialization is unavoidable within the field as well. Is there hope in individual strategies for action? Well, many of the practitioners that I've spoken to over the years have said that they have individual strategies to counter discrimination, to challenge the prejudice with which they are treated. We have some strategies here focused on additional work. Lots and lots of practitioners talked about doing extra work or being extra good at their job. And the second practitioner on this slide illustrates how he utilizes, if you like, the very low expectations of what he can do and maximizes the benefit of that low expectation in producing work that is very good, and he can build his reputation over time. But I would argue that these individual solutions really don't address the overarching problem because they don't address the systemic change that is needed to really eliminate racism from the field. We need instead a collective approach that is industry initiated, but also draws on the ideas and the inspiration of those practitioners on the ground living discrimination. We need to recognise that the reason for discrimination against practitioners of colour in particular is because they are treated as forms of capital for the occupation and therefore are inevitably racialized, and we need to tackle that. It shouldn't be oversimplified, diversity shouldn't be oversimplified as just numbers, as a way of making the industry feel more comfortable with itself, or an effort in justification and legitimacy for the professional project. There is no evidence that any of those things generate real change. Instead, I think we need to look at anti-racism initiatives within the occupation as a struggle for human rights, for voice and recognition, as a way of improving democracy, a political challenge for the occupation in a world where politics rarely impinges other than as a client service. And what that really eventually leads to is that any kind of anti-racism that the industry claims to engage in has to be a reflexive exercise that treats racism and discrimination as our problem and not their problem. So those are my thoughts. I hope that gives you some ideas that you might then want to discuss or possibly ask questions about. Thanks very much for listening.
Yeah. So Any questions or comments on any of what you've heard? And I think our fellow panelists who are not here in person, but whose videos you heard, would also be interested in questions and comments. So if you're able to log on to the site and put them down, that's great. But if not, even if you let me know, I can pass it on to them.
Friday afternoon, 3 o'clock.
Yes.
No,
Yeah.
just as I was listening to what, I was reflecting on not just this session, Debashish, but the day and yesterday.
Yeah.
And a common theme that keeps coming through is the marginalised groups or certain groups in certain sectors are simply not seen and heard, and that the dominant structures continue to erase the visibility and
Sure.
the voices of those people, and so I was, as I said, I get very depressed about it. But at the same time, I have to go back to what I'm just going to raise myself up, so I'm not quite a hobbit up here. And I was trying to work around, because I keep going back to the question you asked me about care. And it's around those structures and the way in which the expected is somehow remains almost impervious to change. And that's the thing. That's when I lose hope.
Yeah.
I want to just go and grow a garden because I can't cope with all this other stuff. But so that's I guess I've got two things going on. One is this theme and these constant impervious structures, and then having this juggle about what's my role as an academic, as a researcher, as a human being in moving beyond those individual efforts, because the individual in the individual space, you can manage, or I can manage my own individual space, but then how do we get beyond that and translate it into really shattering those bigger structures that are almost hard, they're almost intangible, but they're very real.
Right.
I don't
So
know.
one way perhaps is to create alternative realities, really. So which make the existing structures invisible in some ways. So when you're working at the ground level, for instance, and you connect with similar people and create that mass, which makes that real, and so therefore you slowly chip away at the structures really, and make them not as important. So I don't know. It's probably idealistic, but.
Okay, so maybe not in my lifetime, but
without hope we can't go forward.
We can't go anywhere.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
okay.
we need
I think
hope,
that's what
right?
I'm going to leave with, because that was the bottom line of your presentation. Yeah, and you gave us, there were 3 ways about dismantling structures, values, and something else. I can't remember. I thought maybe I'll just go and look at that. Yeah. But thank you. Thank you. I really enjoyed that, and I liked the way you did it. Front up, you talk, and then we listen to everybody else.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Lots of time to think.
Well, I suppose we've gone way over time anyway, so.
Slightly.
Slightly.
So if we don't have other comments, we can sign off now and talk informally, whatever you please. That's okay. And if you think of questions later on, as I keep saying that, please, the site will be open for, I think, quite a while. So if you have questions and comments and you think about it sometime late tonight or tomorrow, just log back in and put a question or comment, and hopefully we'll have a discussion going there online in line with the objectives of the virtual conference.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll sign off then.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening.